So we come this evening to the third temptation of Jesus. And this temptation corresponds with Luther's third enemy that he discusses in the Large Catechism, the devil, which Luther associates specifically with spiritual attacks and spiritual temptations. And Luther says here that pertaining to spiritual matters, that the devil is always striving to lead us into unbelief or false security or stubbornness towards God on the one hand, or he says that he strives to drive us to despair, right? To give up our hope in God altogether. And it's interesting, he said, we were talking about this last week, how Luther said that, temptations of the flesh tend to especially afflict young people, and that temptations of the world tend to afflict older people. And he says that temptations of the Spirit, especially, he says, afflict people who are concerned with spiritual things. And he says especially strong Christians are going to be afflicted by temptations of the Spirit. And so we're going to talk about that tonight. But these, I talked about how these temptations of the world that we talked about last week, right? How destructive those things can be, right? When you think about the wars that are raging, temptations of the Spirit can likewise be enormously destructive in perhaps a different kind of way. And I think back to when we first moved to New England. So we moved to New England, I guess it was 2003. And it was just the year before that the Boston Globe broke this story of the abuses that were going on in the Catholic Archdiocese in Boston. And, there's a lot going on there, but I think at the heart of that, we're going to come back to this, I think at the heart of that was a sort of, was a spiritual problem. Right, and the results of that were enormous. Boston, historically has been this enormously Catholic city, right? And attendance at Catholic churches just fell off a cliff overnight. They over the course of a year or two, they wound up having to close 70 parishes, just in the Boston Archdiocese alone. And so, most of those people who walked away, right, they didn't go someplace else, right? They just walked away from the faith. Likewise, I had a friend who was a pastor in Seattle, and which is used to be home to a very large church that some of you may have heard of called Mars Hill Church. And the pastor there was a young man named Mark Driscoll who was enormously gifted in a lot of ways, but also it turned out kind of an abusive, sort of emotionally, spiritually abusive guy. And again, when this came out, basically this closed church, and this is a church where they had a weekly attendance of 12,000 people. It just closed down almost overnight, right? And these people, who had been attending this church, are just kind of cast into the outer darkness. And my friend, who was a pastor, he's a pastor of a Lutheran church there, had a few of these folks washed up at his church, and he was just sharing with me, how hurt and just kind of damaged they were by, the hypocrisy that had been revealed in that church. And so these spiritual temptations, as we're going to see, can often be very subtle, but they're also enormously dangerous because the sins that come out of these temptations kill souls, right? They kill faith. And not only in the person who gives into the sin, but in people around them. And so I want to look at these temptations of the Spirit this evening. So what's the third temptation here? The final one in Luke's telling anyway, the devil takes Jesus and he takes him up to the pinnacle of the temple, and what does he say? Where that was last time. This time he says, if you're the Son of God, what? Throw yourself down, right? And he's going to, right? Scripture says he's going to send his angels to keep you from getting hurt. I have to say, maybe it's because I'm sort of uneasy about heights. Like, this is not, I've never really felt, the full power of this particular temptation, But a couple things about this. First of all, I just to talk about the setting of this. Our translation says it's the pinnacle of the temple. It's not really clear where this is, right? I always imagined it like up on the top of the sanctuary, which it could have been. But actually, the word I was looking at in Greek, the word actually means something more like wing or extremity. And it's actually just as likely, maybe even more likely, that they're out on the outer wall of the temple complex. And Josephus actually talks about these walls. So on the one wall, I forget which one it was, but I guess it was where the royal portico was. On that wall looked over the Kidron Valley. And so you this like sheer drop from there was kind of like a battlement up on top of the wall. And the sheer drop down to the valley. And I believe Josephus said it was like 600 feet. And, think about it, like this is a time when, skyscrapers didn't exist, right? Most people's, buildings are maybe like a couple stories high. So people didn't have experience of, high places generally. And so it was, Josephus noted that, and it sort of struck him that it was so high up that he said you couldn't look over the edge without feeling dizzy. And so it may be on maybe the corner, that southwest corner of the temple there, kind of at the edge of the Kidron Valley. We're not really sure where it was, but it's very possible that it was on the outer wall someplace. So wherever he is, right, the devil's got Jesus up someplace high, right? And notice here he quotes Scripture to him, right? Jesus has been defeating Satan with quotations from Scripture, and now the devil says, hey, I can do that too, right? And there's something very interesting here, that he returns to this almost taunt that he has in the first temptation, right? If you're the Son of God, right? And in that first one, he says, well, if you're the Son of God, use your power to serve yourself. And Jesus says, no, he's going to, right? Man does not live by bread alone, right? Jesus shows that he's going to trust in his Father. And so the devil kind of reverses it here. He says, well, if you're the Son of God, then let's see how much you trust your Father, right? And look at the Scripture verse that supports my argument here. Now, I include our psalm actually includes the verse that the devil's quoting. Did you notice he leaves part of it out? He quotes, so the devil here quotes, he says, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. And in Psalm 91, what it says, for he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. And in biblical language, I mean, that's moral language, right? What the psalm is saying is that God will send his angels to guard you, to keep you on the right track. And the devil omits that part, right? It doesn't serve his purposes. So it's a reminder that context in the Bible is very, very important. And so we should always, when somebody quotes Scripture to us, right, we should always go back and look and see what it actually says in context, because sometimes it's not what's presented. So what do you guys make of this particular temptation? Does anybody find this like particularly compelling? I see the head shaking, right? I guess you guys feel the same way about heights that I do. This is very subtle, though, right? Because what it looks like, I mean, the devil's already determined that Jesus is not out to serve himself in kind of the usual ways. And so he invites him to this action that looks like an act of enormous faith, right? And it also looks sacrificial, right? It has a sacrificial kind of shape to it. And so the devil comes at him from this very different direction. Yeah, it looks like this act of faith, but what it actually is, right, it's actually designed to force God to act, which is not faith, right? It's designed to force God to act, which is not faith. Moreover, if angels really were to swoop in and catch Jesus and bring him to the ground, from this very high spot in the middle of Jerusalem, where presumably a lot of people would witness this, this is would be pretty grand way to kind of announce to the world that Jesus is the Messiah, right? And so it winds up being, it looks sacrificial, it looks, like this sort of radical act of faith, but it actually winds up being self-serving in that it demands the action of God and demands the attention of people. See? And I think that's the nature of a certain kind of spiritual temptation. Spiritual temptations come in lots of different forms, as Luther says. But I think there's a particular kind of spiritual temptation that those of us, I think that people who are deeply faithful, who are religious, are maybe particularly susceptible to this kind of temptation, to the kind of sacrificial or outwardly faithful act that either demands an action on the part of God, or is really designed to gain the appreciation of people, right? And you see this. It comes in all different forms. I think that some of the kind of health and wealth, the sort of name it and claim it teaching that you get in the prosperity gospel is this kind of thing, right? Where if you believe enough and you pray for this thing with enough faith and you reach out, God is going, God needs to act and give you this thing, right? And it's that sounds like a lot of faith, right? But really what it is, it's a kind of magic, right? That you believe hard enough and you say the right words and then God's going to do this, right? That's magic. And it sounds like faith, but it's really not. It's designed to force God to act. Or likewise, right? There, sometimes our acts of sacrificial service are done. We think that they put God in our debt, right? Or we expect other people are going to see these things and appreciate us the way they should, right? This is what Jesus accuses the Pharisees of in the Gospel of Matthew, right? He warns against being like the Pharisees, and he warns when he's teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, when you pray, right? Don't be like the hypocrites, because where do they pray? In the street corner, right? Why? Right? On the pinnacle, right? So everybody can see them. And presumably, if people have seen them, then they've gotten what they want, right? They've received their reward. But when you pray, go into your closet, right? Where only God can see you. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And so, Jesus warns us against these kinds, a kind of religiosity that looks sacrificial, right? But is really, really designed to gain the applause of people, right? Or that's designed to try to put God in our debt. Because, right, we can never put God in our debt. We can never put God in our debt. Malcolm Guite had a really great insight about this temptation of Jesus. And the thing that struck him about it is that he thought it was significant that the devil takes Jesus up high, because it invites Jesus to sort of look down on everybody else who's down there, right? And that's what that's sort of the nature of spiritual pride, right? Often it may look humble, it may look sacrificial, it may look like a martyr, but inside, or the person who gives into these things is looking down on those around them. And right, it causes you to think of yourself as special and therefore exempt possibly from the natural consequences. And I think that was a lot of what wound up that kind of spiritual pride was at the root of both what happened in Mars Hill and to a certain extent what happened in Boston, right? This kind of spiritual pride that says, we're special and we're entitled and we're exempt. But in both those cases, right, what we see is that God is not mocked. That God is not mocked. And so, Malcolm says, right, well, that we should always be, we should always make sure that we're in a position where we're looking up and not down, right? And Jesus, in responding to the devil, says, do not put the Lord your God to the test, right? Do not put the Lord your God to the test. And that expresses a true kind of faith, right? The true kind of faith that doesn't attempt to force God to act, but goes about one's calling, accepting from God what comes, right? Accepting from God what comes. And that's hard because, sometimes what comes is not easy. And of course, Jesus himself is going to see that, Jesus knows that, right? He's undergoing it in the present of the story, but he's going to experience that in a very extreme way. But in this life, what comes is not always going to be easy. Sometimes it's going to be hard. Sometimes it's going to be heartbreaking. And what we do, right, in those places is that we, from those low places, right, we look up to God and trust in him to be there and to be God and to care for us even in the midst of those circumstances. And then we continue to follow him in our vocations, right, as husbands and wives and neighbors and workers, right? Wherever God has placed us, he has placed people in our path to serve. And so we go about that, not looking down on those people from up high, but looking up at them as a servant whom God has sent to them. And so we trust, right? We trust. And Jesus teaches us how to do that. And we're going to talk next week about how Jesus is the help, our help in the midst of temptation. And we'll end there for this evening.